Welcome back to the Personal Injury Law Show, viewers. Before the break, we're talking about occupiers' liability and glassings in pubs, hotels and clubs. But we're going through the law so that we can trace it to work out what it is that creates the responsibility and liability on these owners. Now, just curiously, Nonce, what did the dissenting judge in Mowbray say, Kirby?
Well, Kirby of the High Court said that there should have been a duty of care on behalf of the shopping centre with regard to this incident. He felt that it was a minimal cost at the shopping centre to avoid
keep the lights on for a little bit longer.
And to avoid this incident. So it was reasonably foreseeable for that to happen, which, look, I tend to agree with it. I'm
actually outraged that Mowbray, the case fell the way it did because realistically...
Yeah, I think that's right, Tony. And I think what a lot of people don't know about Mowbray is that the lights got turned off at the same time that the shop closed. So the man who was working, the gentleman who was working in the shop and who was assaulted, closed up shop. 15 minutes later, he's out to get the car, but the lights had already been turned off either before or at the time he closed the shop. And so what Kirby said, as Monsieur says, is that it wouldn't have cost much to remedy that and make it a bit safer.
Well, it's not to say that he wouldn't have been assaulted anyway, but it's a good preventative when you've got lights and...
But also it was raised by the video store about, leaving the lights on a bit longer, and so they're on notice about it as well. So I think there's a sort of, a
assuming
knowledge.
That's right.
The plaintiff in this case didn't sue the employer because there's no common law in South Australia.
That's
in work
right.
cover.
That's right.
So they sued the third party, which was a shopping centre. But if it had been the employer, I would have hazarded to guess that the plaintiff would have won.
Well, the High Court did say that that if there's a special relationship such as employer-employee, student versus pupil, that these type of things will come up. There will be a duty, but obviously, in this instance it didn't.
Tell us about Adele's Palace, please, Alice.
Adele's Palace is a restaurant, and on a New Year's Eve party, it was quite busy one night, and an argument arose between two female patrons, and there was a bit more of a fight. Friends and relatives got involved, and it became, I think, a bit of an all-in brawl, and some people got very hurt. And the High Court heard a case for the injured patrons who said that there wasn't any or enough security on the night in the restaurant. And they found that despite the fact that there were no real security guards, it was New Year's Eve, everybody's charged up, it's a big party, that the restaurant wasn't liable for the injuries to the patrons.
But what happened here was one of the ones that got into the fight took off and came back with a gun.
Yeah.
That's right.
So the High Court, what did they say about that?
Well, again, they said that despite the fact that he came back and shot, I think, two patrons, that with any further security, it wouldn't have made a difference, and such. There was no breach, and if there was security, it wouldn't have prevented the incident.
Well, I'll just repeat the words of the court. Yep. The court said that the gunman's conduct was not rational and predictable, and it was therefore not probable that the presence of security guards would have deterred.
It's arguable, Tony. So I think in this case they had a lot of expert opinion about, what security, I suppose the implementation of security would have done to the, or prevented the incident, but it wasn't found in the plaintiff's
Can you think
favour.
of a case where, Alice, where you'd have liability in these circumstances?
Look, Tony, it's hard to think of these cases because it seems that the courts traditionally have found that the responsibility lies with the individual for their own actions. But I think in this case, what's really interesting is there were no security guards, so there was no way to stop the fight earlier before it escalated out of control.
I like that.
And maybe perhaps that was something that could have been looked at a little bit more closely.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be hard to run these cases, generally speaking, and it appears that the courts are not too keen to put liability on an occupier for the actions of the individuals.
We might have to start getting technical and try and get them on breach of statutory duties.
Well, common law is becoming more and more difficult, so I think that's the way it's heading, unfortunately.
That's right, and might have something to do with the
Could you have argued that
legalising.
they could have had cameras up and security and other things?
I think that those would be valid arguments, although I think a lot of arguments got made in favour of the plaintiffs, on the day. But it's more about the liability of the occupier, and maybe it is worth looking at those statutory obligations as per each state.
Can I just... OK, we've got the background cases which are very unsupportive. Let's translate that into how would an occupier, publican, that is pub or bar, be responsible if someone, one of the other patrons, gets intoxicated and uses a glass jug or a bottle to glass someone? Nuncio.
Well, listen, it all depends, Tony, I suppose, the facts. But if this, person who does the glassing has been in trouble throughout the night, and I suppose they've got knowledge of the fact that he may be trouble, then the pub or the owner or the publican will have some sort of duty because they're on knowledge or on notice about it. That's where the High Court in Adil's Palace made, a lot of comments about having knowledge. If you do have knowledge, then I think your duty's higher.
That's right.
Are you for or against the plastic cups in these?
I don't know if I'm a big
Establishments.
plastic cups fan, Tony.
I'm totally against it.
I think it's going to depend largely on the venue in question. And as Nunzio said, knowledge is a big part of it. So.
Alice, this is a guy that wants glass in pubs, and yet he drinks a coffee out of a a paper cup.
That's just a preference for my coffee, Tony. But it's just look. If we're going to the fact that we need, paper cups in clubs and bars, then look, I'm disappointed.
You're disappointed?
Yeah, I'm disappointed.
What about the fact that you might save someone from a massive scar or brain damage?
But glass, then someone can bring a weapon in. Where does it stop? Should we
Well,
have
it just
metal
shows-
detectors in all clubs now?
That's
Look,
right.
where
I
does it
think
stop?
you probably should.
Well, again, that's
There
disappointing.
was a time
for me to that
there
point.
at Crown Casino where they had, you had to produce your driver's licence.
Yep.
They took a photo and they stopped doing it because the other establishments weren't doing it, and so people weren't going to that.
I can appreciate in certain areas where it's also high risk of violence that you should, but if it happens widespread, then again, that'll be really disappointing.
Very few people are going to go to a bar or club and order a Grange or a Melton Shandon like you do. So, it's usually the people that are doing the hitting with the bottles and glassings that are just your average Joe Blow going out there for a drink and gets a bit too intoxicated and unruly behaviour. So.
That's right. And I think everyone's going to need to be vigilant. Just because of the court's decisions at the moment, it doesn't mean that owners will be let off the hook if there's trouble brewing and they don't do anything about it. So I think.
Look, the state of the law is pretty poor, I would have thought.
It's becoming
It's
more and more
difficult,
difficult.
yeah.
That's the harsh part. I said, they're, I suppose, saying that you should take personal responsibility for all the actions happening. And look, there's merit in that, but at the same time, it's making it more and more difficult to litigate on that.
I guess if you've got young children or younger kids that are going to bars and clubs, you'll take my stance. I think plastic cups, after about 2 or 3 drinks, you wouldn't know the difference anyway. And it's probably cheaper for them too.
Yeah.
Probably for the pubs involved.
I didn't realise you were such a connoisseur of spirits and wines and that, Nuncio.
Look, yes, and Tony, it's just one of those things that, it's personal preference, but again, I hope we don't get to that point. So.
I think that if we get these cases in the future, we're going to have to rely more on the Liquor Licensing Act and
That's
the
right.
Wrongs Act and the statutory provisions. Look, we're going to have to come back to this topic another time, which I do want to
Interesting
do.
one.
Alice, thanks for coming on board. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
And viewers, stay tuned. We'll be back with Kathy's mailbag just after the break. Thank you.